The sharp scream of little Ryan sliced through the chilled air of the luxurious Park Avenue penthouse in New York City. The boy, who was merely 1 year and 6 months old, was red in the face from crying so intensely, his tiny fists swinging wildly as if battling the entire universe. Victor Norton, a man of 52 years, stood frozen near the door, his $50,000 tailored suit completely ruined by the pear puree his son had just spat out. The most feared billionaire in Manhattan looked like an utterly defeated man, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the heir who fiercely rejected everyone and everything around him. "Mr. Norton! I simply cannot take this anymore!" shouted Alice, the highly recommended nanny hired exactly 1 week ago. She was the 8th professional to quit in just 2 months, throwing her arms up in total frustration. "This child is not normal in any way. He bites me, scratches my arms, and spits his food right in my face, so I resign immediately." The 40-year-old woman, who boasted a prestigious degree in early childhood education and 15 years of elite experience, threw her pristine apron onto the polished hardwood floor and stormed out. The sharp clicking of her high heels echoed down the massive hallway until it vanished into the private elevator, leaving Victor staring hopelessly at his weeping son. The sprawling 500-square-meter apartment had never felt so painfully hollow and desolate since his beloved wife Lily passed away exactly 1 year ago. "Ryan, please calm down. Daddy is right here with you," Victor murmured softly, extending his trembling hands to gently lift the distressed boy from his custom-made Italian crib. But Ryan forcefully pulled his little body backward, twisting away from his father's touch and instantly raising the sheer volume of his desperate, heartbreaking wails. Victor sank into the leather armchair next to the crib, running his hands through his silver hair, realizing that commanding a financial empire worth billions meant absolutely nothing if he could not soothe his own flesh and blood. "Mr. Norton." The gentle voice of the head housekeeper, Clara, drifted softly from the bedroom doorway, interrupting his dark thoughts. "I apologize for the intrusion, but the agency called to say the morning cleaner fell ill, so they are sending a night shift worker named Brenda Vance to cover the emergency." Victor sighed heavily, exhausted beyond words, and replied that it did not matter who came, as long as she remained completely silent so the baby could hopefully sleep. Clara nodded respectfully and quietly exited the room, leaving the powerful tycoon to sit helplessly on the cold marble floor, listening to his son's endless sorrow and feeling like the biggest failure of a father in the entire world. Meanwhile, Brenda Vance was standing inside the cramped service elevator, slowly ascending to the highest floor of the most exclusive residential skyscraper in Manhattan. She gripped the handle of her heavy cleaning cart tightly, desperately trying to ignore the deep exhaustion settling into her bones after sleeping for barely 3 hours. She had spent the entire night sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair at a public hospital in the Bronx, holding the fragile hand of her seriously ill mother, Diana. The compassionate nurses had urged her to go home and rest, but Brenda did not have the luxury of resting when the expensive experimental medications her mother needed demanded every extra cent she could possibly earn. The elevator softly dinged as it arrived at the 42nd floor, and Brenda pushed her heavy cart out into the familiar long service corridor. She had been working the lonely midnight shifts in this wealthy building for 4 months, embracing the silent, invisible nature of the grueling work because it kept her completely focused on her ultimate goal. Today, however, the usual quiet of the penthouse floor was violently shattered by the unmistakable sounds of a screeching toddler and frustrated adult voices echoing from Mr. Norton's grand apartment. While organizing her glass cleaners and fresh microfiber cloths, a furious woman marched past her toward the main elevator, loudly complaining into her cell phone about how the billionaire's impossible child was a completely lost cause. As the angry nanny disappeared behind the closing elevator doors, Brenda paused her work, her heart aching as she listened to the relentless, sorrowful sobbing coming from inside the massive apartment. That specific pitch of absolute despair was something Brenda recognized intimately. It was the exact same sound she used to make as a frightened little girl when her father abandoned their family, leaving her and Diana completely alone in the rough neighborhoods of the Bronx. That poor little boy is carrying so much pain inside his tiny heart. She whispered gently to herself methodically, wringing out her damp mop while fighting back a sudden wave of sympathetic tears. Just as Brenda was finishing her shift, hoping to scrape together enough extra cash to cover half of the terrifying hospital bills, her cheap mobile phone vibrated intensely in her uniform pocket. It was an urgent text message from Rachel, the stern supervisor of the cleaning company, demanding that Brenda rush straight into Mr. Norton's apartment because a major kitchen pipe had suddenly burst. The supervisor explained that the wealthy owner was completely panicked about his priceless antique furniture getting ruined by the spreading floodwaters, and he was offering a generous cash bonus to whoever could fix the disastrous mess immediately. Knowing that this unexpected bonus could literally buy her mother a few more days of life-saving medicine, Brenda grabbed her heavy, wet vacuum equipment and practically sprinted toward the kitchen entrance of the penthouse. Brenda pushed her heavy equipment through the service door and was immediately met by a frantic Clara, who pointed frantically toward the rapidly expanding pool of water soaking the expansive kitchen floor. "Thank goodness you arrived so quickly, Brenda, because the water is already creeping toward the formal living room, and Mr. Norton is trapped in the nursery with the ninth nanny trying to calm that poor, crying child," Clara explained in a hushed, terrified whisper. Brenda wasted absolutely no time instantly powering on the specialized wet vacuum and working with practiced efficiency to suck up the spreading disaster before it could reach the priceless Persian rugs. She moved in complete silence, deeply respecting the strict orders to avoid making any unnecessary noise that might further upset the already distressed billionaire and his inconsolable toddler. After working tirelessly for a solid hour, the kitchen and the adjoining hallway were completely dry and safe from the devastating water damage that had threatened the extravagant Manhattan residence. Brenda wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her tired hand, carefully gathering her damp rags and heavy buckets to quietly make her way out of the luxurious apartment. As she tiptoed silently past the grand hallway leading to the master bedrooms, she noticed a slightly ajar door and heard the hushed, deeply annoyed voice of a young woman speaking on her mobile phone. "I know this kid is an absolute nightmare, Mom, but the paycheck is incredibly huge, so I will just pretend to care until tomorrow morning, and then I am quitting this horrible nightmare," the temporary nanny muttered coldly. Brenda stopped dead in her tracks, a hot wave of pure maternal anger rushing through her exhausted veins as she listened to the callous woman completely dismiss the suffering of a grieving child. Inside the dimly lit nursery, little Ryan suddenly stirred in his expensive wooden crib, his tiny face scrunching up in evident distress as he saw the new nanny actively ignoring him to continue her selfish phone conversation. Brenda knew that within mere seconds, the fragile boy would inevitably start screaming again, but right before the tears could fall, his wide, bright green eyes locked directly onto Brenda's compassionate gaze through the narrow opening of the heavy mahogany door. It felt as though time had completely stopped in that lavish New York apartment when Ryan stared at the humble cleaner with a profound, quiet curiosity that Brenda had never witnessed in someone so incredibly young. Driven by a pure, undeniable instinct to protect the innocent child, Brenda gently pressed her index finger to her own lips and mouthed a silent, comforting reassurance to the little boy. Miraculously, Ryan did not cry. Instead, he slowly pulled his tiny body upward, using the ornate wooden bars of his crib, never breaking his intense eye contact with the strange woman standing secretly in the hallway. Completely oblivious to the silent interaction happening right behind her back, the uncaring nanny continued complaining bitterly about the neurotic billionaire father and his supposedly broken, uncontrollable son. Unable to stop herself, Brenda took a brave, silent step inside the luxurious nursery, whispering a soft, tender greeting to the little boy who seemed to be silently begging for a genuine connection. Ryan babbled a sweet, incomprehensible string of baby words and courageously stretched both of his tiny, trembling arms directly toward the exhausted woman in the damp blue cleaning uniform. Throwing caution and professional boundaries completely to the wind, Brenda gently reached over the crib's railing and scooped the remarkably light boy into her warm, protective embrace. "Hello there, you sweet little angel. I bet you are just desperately craving some real affection, aren't you?" she murmured softly, against his soft hair, swaying him in a rhythmic, deeply soothing motion. Ryan instantly buried his small face into the crook of Brenda's neck, his tiny fists gripping her cheap cotton shirt, as if she were the safest harbor he had ever known in his short, tragic life. The sudden silence in the room finally alerted the distracted nanny, who spun around and dropped her jaw in absolute horror upon seeing a random cleaning lady intimately holding the billionaire's precious heir. "What on earth do you think you are doing? You need to hand him back to me this instant before I call security," the furious woman hissed, lunging forward to violently snatch the resting toddler away. But the moment Ryan saw the angry nanny approaching, he let out a terrified whimper and clung even tighter to Brenda, burying his face deeper into her shoulder to completely hide from the terrible woman. Just as the chaotic confrontation was about to escalate into a shouting match, the heavy bedroom door swung open to reveal a thoroughly exhausted Victor Norton, whose tired eyes widened in pure shock at the unbelievable scene unfolding before him. "What exactly is going on in my son's room?" Victor demanded, with a stern, authoritative voice, causing the panicked nanny to instantly freeze in her tracks, while Brenda nervously tried to find the right words to explain her unauthorized presence. Before anyone could utter a single excuse, little Ryan lifted his head from Brenda's shoulder, looked directly at his father, and bestowed a gentle, loving kiss onto Brenda's cheek, leaving the powerful Manhattan tycoon completely speechless. The sheer magnitude of the gentle kiss echoed louder than any scream in that silent nursery, prompting Victor to slowly step forward, as if approaching a beautiful mirage he feared might suddenly disappear. "He kissed you," the billionaire whispered in absolute disbelief, his eyes darting between his perfectly calm son and the nervous cleaner who was gently rocking the boy with natural maternal grace. Before Brenda could even attempt to formulate a proper apology for overstepping her professional duties, Victor turned his icy gaze toward the stunned nanny and firmly ordered her to pack her bags and leave his property immediately, effectively ending her employment on the spot. Once the fired nanny had hastily scurried out of the grand apartment, Victor gently pulled up a velvet chair and sat directly across from Brenda, his posture devoid of his usual corporate intimidation. "My son has violently rejected absolutely everyone since my wife passed away, including myself. So please tell me how a stranger managed to bring him such incredible peace in a matter of minutes." Victor pleaded, his voice breaking with genuine heartbreaking vulnerability. Brenda looked down at the sleeping angel in her arms and softly explained that she understood Ryan's deep sorrow because she had experienced that exact same lonely, terrifying grief when her own father abandoned her family in the Bronx so many years ago. These highly educated professionals only see a broken child and a massive paycheck, but Ryan does not need an elite pedagogy degree. He desperately needs someone who will look at him and offer genuine, unconditional love, Brenda stated with profound conviction. Victor listened intently to every single word, realizing that this humble, exhausted woman possessed more emotional intelligence and authentic compassion than all the prestigious experts he had frantically hired over the past agonizing months. Without a moment of hesitation, Victor leaned forward and offered Brenda the position of Ryan's permanent caregiver, promising to pay her triple her current salary and fully cover every single medical expense for her ailing mother's experimental treatments. Overwhelmed by the life-changing generosity that would literally save her mother's life, Brenda tearfully accepted the unbelievable offer, vowing to protect and cherish little Ryan, as if he were her very own flesh and blood. 3 incredibly joyful weeks swiftly passed, transforming the once mournful, silent penthouse into a vibrant home filled with bright laughter, playful chasing games, and the sweet sound of Ryan happily calling out for his beloved Bree. Victor found himself rushing home from his corporate headquarters much earlier every evening, his heart soaring every time he walked through the door to find his previously broken son giggling uncontrollably in Brenda's loving, protective arms. The beautiful tranquility of their newly formed routine was abruptly shattered one rainy Tuesday afternoon when the private elevator doors burst open to reveal Leonard Barnes, the impeccably dressed, relentlessly ambitious brother of Victor's late wife, Lily. Leonard was a completely ruthless 40-year-old corporate lawyer who served as the primary trustee of Ryan's massive inheritance fund, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as he marched straight into Victor's opulent home office. "Victor, we need to have a very serious conversation immediately about the completely unacceptable rumors I am hearing regarding the absolute peasant you have recklessly allowed to raise my beloved sister's only child," Leonard spat out bitterly. Victor firmly stood his ground behind his massive oak desk, his jaw clenching tightly as he aggressively defended Brenda's impeccable character and the miraculous, undeniable joy she had single-handedly brought back into his son's shattered life. "She is not merely a peasant, Leonard. She is the only human being on this earth who managed to pull Ryan out of his severe depression, and her previous job as a cleaner is entirely irrelevant to her magnificent heart." Victor fired back fiercely. Leonard scoffed loudly, pacing the expensive carpet, while arguing that the sole heir to the monumental Norton financial empire required elite cultural refinement, prestigious tutoring, and a sophisticated guardian, not a hopelessly uneducated woman from the impoverished streets of the Bronx. Right in the middle of their heated, escalating argument, Brenda completely unknowingly walked into the grand office carrying a very happy Ryan, who was holding a brightly colored plastic toy and babbling joyfully about his day. The moment the little boy spotted his severe, judgmental uncle standing aggressively in the room, Ryan's bright smile instantly vanished, and he tightly wrapped his small arms around Brenda's neck, burying his face into her shoulder for ultimate safety. Leonard watched this undeniable display of absolute preference with narrowed, calculating eyes, his pride deeply wounded by the undeniable fact that his own nephew overwhelmingly preferred the comforting embrace of a lowly maid over his own prestigious blood relative. "You are actively allowing this manipulative lower-class woman to completely erase the sacred memory of my sister, and I will absolutely not stand by and watch you destroy this family's legacy," Leonard threatened menacingly as he aggressively snatched his expensive leather briefcase. He stormed out of the luxurious penthouse without another word, leaving a heavy, toxic cloud of anxiety hanging over the room, while Victor deeply feared that his powerful, ruthless brother-in-law would inevitably weaponize his vast legal resources to tear their fragile, newly found happiness completely apart. 2 tense weeks after Leonard's ominous departure, Victor was peacefully sipping his morning coffee when his mobile phone erupted into a frantic symphony of endless notifications and an urgent, panicked incoming call from his executive assistant, Sarah. "Mr. Norton, you absolutely must look at the internet right this second, because there is a massive coordinated media scandal blowing up across every major gossip outlet and financial news platform. Sarah yelled through the speaker, her voice trembling with genuine professional terror. Victor's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss as he quickly opened his silver laptop, his eyes widening in pure horror at the devastatingly cruel headlines violently plastered across the glowing digital screen. The malicious articles featured highly invasive, secretly captured paparazzi photographs of Victor, Brenda, and little Ryan enjoying a beautifully innocent afternoon picnic together on the lush green lawns of Central Park just the previous weekend. The vicious headlines screamed outrageous lies. Billionaire widower brainwashed by manipulative Bronx cleaning lady, and Norton heir placed in extreme danger by reckless, unqualified gold digger, painting their wholesome family outing as a deeply sinister, calculated trap. Anonymous sources, who Victor immediately suspected were heavily bribed by Leonard, viciously claimed that Brenda was deliberately neglecting the child's basic educational needs and using dark, seductive tactics to completely control the grieving, vulnerable tycoon. Before Victor could even attempt to process the absolute cruelty of the fabricated scandal, his phone aggressively rang again, this time displaying the incredibly stern name of Robert Adams, the fiercely conservative president of the company's powerful board of directors. Victor, our prestigious investors are threatening to completely pull their massive capital out of our upcoming ventures because your messy personal life is making you look wildly unstable and dangerously compromised. Robert barked forcefully through the secure corporate line. The furious board president demanded that Victor immediately terminate the controversial Nanny to salvage the company's plummeting public image, completely ignoring Victor's desperate pleas that Brenda was the sole reason his beloved son was finally surviving. The nightmare relentlessly compounded when Victor's brilliant personal lawyer Matthew called just moments later with news that sent a paralyzing shock of pure terror straight into Victor's frantically racing heart. Leonard Barnes has officially filed an emergency legal petition in the Manhattan family court, aggressively demanding full physical custody of Ryan by brutally accusing you of gross parental negligence and severe moral turpitude. The lawyer explained with a heavy, deeply concerned sigh. Matthew painfully clarified that Leonard had successfully weaponized the terrible tabloids and gathered bitter testimonies from the previously fired nannies, perfectly crafting a devastatingly false narrative that Victor was an unfit father blindly entrusting an empire's heir to a dangerous grifter. In order to absolutely guarantee that we maintain your rightful custody of Ryan during the strict judicial investigation, we must drastically eliminate any perceived chaotic elements from your household immediately. Matthew advised with cold, calculated legal logic. Victor felt a crushing, suffocating weight violently compress his chest as he realized the horrific sacrifice he was being forced to make. He had to willingly break his own son's heart in order to physically keep him. If he proudly kept Brenda in the apartment to fight for their love, the ruthless family court could very well rip Ryan away and hand him over to a cold, calculating man who cared only about wealth and prestige. Victor slowly walked back into the bright, sunny living room, feeling like an absolute monster as he watched Brenda cheerfully building a massive, colorful fortress out of plastic blocks with a giggling, utterly radiant Ryan. The devastating sorrow radiating from Victor's pale face instantly alerted Brenda, who gently set down a bright yellow block and walked over to him, her warm eyes filled with deep, unconditional concern for the man she had secretly grown to love. With a shattering voice, Victor explained the absolute severity of the emergency custody petition and the heartbreaking reality that her continued presence in the penthouse would inevitably cost him his precious son. Tears quietly streamed down Brenda's beautiful face, but she bravely nodded in complete understanding, knowing deep in her pure soul that a child fundamentally belonged with his devoted, loving father above all else. "I will pack my modest belongings and leave immediately, Mr. Norton, because Ryan's ultimate safety and your legal victory are the only things that truly matter in this terrifying situation," she whispered, selflessly sacrificing her own immense happiness for their ultimate protection. Victor promised to continuously fund her mother's vital treatments and provide a massive financial severance, but the money felt like absolutely nothing compared to the tragic loss of the incredible woman who had breathed life back into his broken home. When the time finally came to brutally say goodbye, Victor and Brenda fabricated a gentle, agonizingly painful lie for the confused little boy, explaining that his beloved Bree desperately needed to travel far away to care for her ailing grandmother. Ryan whimpered softly, his tiny hands gripping Brenda's shirt, exactly as he had done on their very first magical night together, while Victor stood helplessly in the background, tears silently falling down his own face. As the heavy penthouse doors finally clicked shut behind Brenda, the massive Manhattan apartment instantly plunged back into a freezing, echoing silence, leaving a shattered father and a crying baby, alone in their vast, empty fortress of immense wealth. 3 incredibly agonizing days crawled by since Brenda's heartbreaking departure, and the luxurious Park Avenue penthouse had violently reverted into a deeply sorrowful, overwhelmingly silent tomb that continuously echoed with endless tragedy. Little Ryan practically refused to eat his beautifully prepared meals, spending hours desperately wandering the massive hallways while constantly crying out for his beloved Bree with a deeply shattered, hopelessly confused voice. Victor had frantically hired yet another highly recommended, thoroughly elite nanny to appease the demanding court investigators, but Ryan completely rejected the stranger, violently throwing his favorite toys and retreating into a dark shell of profound, unshakable grief. Meanwhile, deep inside the sterile walls of a bustling public hospital in the Bronx, Brenda spent every waking moment holding the frail hand of her severely ill mother, Diana, whose condition had dramatically worsened. "My sweet, precious daughter, you look so incredibly sad and exhausted. Please tell me what truly happened with that lovely little boy you cared for," Diana weakly pleaded, noticing the profound lack of joy in Brenda's usually bright, hopeful eyes. Brenda courageously forced a gentle, reassuring smile, bravely lying to her mother that everything was perfectly fine, secretly bearing the crushing weight of her completely shattered heart, entirely alone to protect her mother's fragile health. The terrifying morning of the emergency custody hearing finally arrived, bringing a suffocating cloud of intense anxiety as Victor and his lawyer walked into the imposing, heavily wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Manhattan. Leonard Barnes sat confidently at the opposing grand table, flanked by 3 incredibly expensive corporate litigators and a massive mountain of perfectly organized, highly deceptive documents designed to completely destroy Victor's parental reputation. "Your Honor, I am standing here today simply to rescue my beloved sister's innocent child from a dangerously unstable father who recklessly allowed a completely uneducated peasant to recklessly endanger a monumental legacy," Leonard began with aggressive theatrical arrogance. Leonard ruthlessly paraded his deeply twisted narrative, confidently presenting the vicious tabloid magazines and officially submitting sworn affidavits from the previously fired nannies who bitterly lied about Brenda manipulating the child's fragile emotions. Victor's hands shook with violent, uncontrollable rage as he listened to his greedy brother-in-law brutally assassinate the pure, beautiful character of the incredible woman who had miraculously saved his dying family. But just as Leonard smugly rested his seemingly flawless case, Victor's brilliant attorney Matthew calmly stood up and confidently requested the immediate permission to call a highly unexpected, incredibly vital surprise witness to the main stand. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom dramatically swung open, and Helen Smith, the highly respected head nurse from the public hospital where Brenda's mother was being heavily treated, walked purposefully toward the central witness box. Nurse Smith, Can you please explicitly detail for this honorable court the incredibly disturbing encounter you experienced with Mr. Barnes precisely 2 weeks ago?" Matthew asked in a booming, highly commanding voice that echoed perfectly across the completely silent courtroom. The experienced nurse looked directly at the stern judge and loudly testified that Leonard had aggressively attempted to bribe her with a massive sum of hidden cash to falsely swear that Brenda had violently abandoned her dying mother. A collective massive gasp of pure shock violently rippled through the crowded gallery as the undeniable reality of Leonard's deeply criminal, incredibly malicious conspiracy was fully exposed to the righteous fury of the presiding magistrate. "She is the most incredibly devoted, fiercely loving daughter I have ever witnessed in my 30 years of medical service, and she spoke of little Ryan with the exact same pure, unconditional love." Nurse Smith proudly concluded, with absolute, undeniable conviction. The enraged judge aggressively slammed his heavy wooden gavel, immediately throwing out the completely fraudulent custody petition and loudly ordering a severe immediate criminal investigation into Leonard's highly illegal, deeply disgusting bribery attempts. The immense crushing weight of 1,000 dark nightmares instantly lifted from Victor's tired shoulders. But his rapidly beating heart immediately realized there was still one incredibly vital, massively important mission left to completely resolve. He practically sprinted out of the imposing courthouse doors, completely ignoring his cheering legal team, and frantically dialed his loyal assistant, Sarah, loudly demanding she track down the exact hospital room where Brenda's mother was currently residing. Upon receiving the precise details, Victor recklessly threw himself into his waiting black car, shouting at his driver to speed fiercely through the chaotic New York traffic, as if his very life depended entirely on reaching the Bronx. Every single second trapped inside the speeding luxury vehicle felt like an absolute agonizing eternity as Victor desperately rehearsed the massive, profound apologies he owed to the beautiful woman he had cowardly pushed away. He continuously pictured his terribly sad, deeply confused little boy back at the lonely apartment, realizing with absolute clarity that protecting his immense wealth and public image meant absolutely nothing if his family was totally broken. When the car finally screeched to a violent halt outside the busy hospital entrance, Victor sprinted through the sliding glass doors, his incredibly determined soul completely ready to violently fight for the beautiful future he so desperately craved. Victor sprinted wildly through the brightly lit, chaotic hospital corridors, his frantic eyes frantically scanning the identical wooden doors until he finally spotted the right room located at the very end of the busy hall. Peering carefully through the small rectangular window, he saw Brenda gently brushing her mother's gray hair, her beautiful face etched with a profound, quiet sorrow that made Victor's heart physically ache with overwhelming guilt. He took a massive, trembling breath, slowly turned the silver handle and softly stepped into the quiet room, causing Brenda to gasp loudly and drop the plastic brush upon seeing the powerful billionaire standing entirely out of breath. The brutal court battle is completely over. The corrupt judge dismissed the fraudulent case, and Leonard is actively being investigated for his terrible crimes. Victor blurted out quickly, desperate to immediately ease any terrible fears she might still harbor. Before Brenda could even process the incredibly joyous news, Victor closed the distance between them, falling deeply to his knees beside her incredibly cheap plastic chair, with tears openly streaming down his handsome face. "I was an incredibly weak, terrified coward to ever let you leave our home, and I am begging you to please forgive my terrible mistakes, because I am hopelessly, completely, deeply in love with you," Victor confessed passionately. Brenda sat completely frozen, in pure, unadulterated shock, her heart aggressively pounding against her ribs as she listened to the incredibly powerful man openly pour out his entirely raw, deeply vulnerable soul right in front of her. But before she could formulate a proper response to his massive, life-altering confession, a tiny, incredibly familiar voice suddenly shrieked with absolute, uncontainable joy from the crowded hallway outside their open door. Little Ryan, who had miraculously managed to escape his totally overwhelmed temporary nanny in the busy lobby downstairs, rushed into the small room as fast as his tiny legs could carry his incredibly excited body. Bree Bree, the ecstatic toddler, practically screamed, launching his incredibly tiny body completely into Brenda's wide, waiting arms, while violently sobbing massive, heavy tears of pure, overwhelming relief and boundless happiness. Brenda buried her tear-soaked face directly into the little boy's soft, incredibly sweet-smelling hair, violently crying as she tightly rocked him back and forth, silently promising the universe that she would absolutely never let him go again. Slowly waking up to the beautiful, incredibly loud commotion, Diana gently opened her incredibly tired eyes, flashing a weak but profoundly knowing smile as she witnessed the completely undeniable, fiercely beautiful love binding the three souls together. Life is far too incredibly short and utterly unpredictable to ever walk away from such true, magnificent love, my beautifully brave daughter. Diana whispered softly, her weak voice carrying the immense, undeniable wisdom of a deeply seasoned lifetime. Encouraged completely by her incredibly supportive mother, Brenda slowly looked up at the handsome billionaire, completely wiping away her happy tears, and softly whispered that she was entirely, overwhelmingly in love with him too. Victor incredibly gently took Brenda's trembling hand, respectfully kissed her soft knuckles, and solemnly promised Diana that he would fiercely protect, wildly, cherish, and perfectly provide for their newly formed family for the absolute rest of his natural life. Exactly 2 wildly magical months later, the luxurious Park Avenue penthouse was beautifully transformed into a deeply spectacular, incredibly intimate wedding venue, completely overflowing with thousands of perfectly white, wonderfully fragrant roses. Diana, who was miraculously recovering incredibly well, thanks to the massively expensive, highly exclusive treatments, proudly walked her incredibly radiant daughter across the plush carpet toward a profoundly happy, fiercely smiling Victor. Little Ryan, dressed in a wonderfully tiny, perfectly tailored tuxedo, triumphantly carried the shiny golden rings on a beautiful blue velvet cushion, happily babbling and joyfully clapping his tiny hands as the happy couple finally shared their incredibly magical, long-awaited kiss. Later that beautiful night, as the glittering, wonderfully bright city lights of Manhattan sparkled perfectly outside the massive glass windows, Victor and Brenda quietly tucked an incredibly exhausted, deeply happy Ryan into his cozy wooden crib. "Are you absolutely positively sure that you are never, ever going to leave me again?" The wonderfully sweet toddler sleepily mumbled tightly, clutching his new mother's incredibly soft, profoundly comforting hand in the quiet darkness. Brenda leaned down, gently kissed his perfectly warm forehead, and promised with her entire wonderfully whole heart that she was fiercely, permanently his absolute mother now, and nothing in the universe could ever tear their beautiful family apart. As the married couple finally stood absolutely together on their grand balcony, wrapping their arms tightly around one another in the beautiful moonlight, they profoundly understood a magnificent universal truth about the deeply complex journey of human existence. True wealth is completely invisible to the greedy eyes of banking institutions, as it resides entirely within the quiet warmth of a deeply faithful family, the undeniable loyalty of a fiercely dedicated partner, and the pure, beautiful laughter of a deeply loved child. We often mistakenly build massive, incredibly tall walls of extreme pride, heavy prejudice, and strict social classes to protect our fragile hearts. Yet true healing requires us to bravely dismantle those terribly cold fortresses. When we willingly surrender our deep fears and wildly embrace completely unexpected, wildly unconditional affection, we miraculously transform our deeply painful tragedies into wonderfully beautiful triumphs. In the profoundly beautiful end, it is never about the massive size of the wealthy bank account or the incredibly prestigious origins of the person, but simply the incredibly vast, deeply magnificent capacity of the human heart to beautifully choose love entirely above all else.